Citing fascinating new studies on sports fandom, Larry Olmsted makes the case that the more you identify with a sports team, the better your social, psychological, and physical health are. The more meaningful your relationships are, and the more connected and happier you are. Even now, Larry argues, the greatly altered games during the COVID-19 pandemic provide socially distanced joy. Larry Olmsted is an award-winning journalist who has been a visiting professor at Dartmouth College, where he taught nonfiction writing. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, Real Food, Fake Food, and Getting into Guinness, a history of the Guinness Book of World Records, a book for which he broke 3 world records himself while researching. He currently writes online columns for Forbes and USA Today, and he appears regularly on television and radio. Olmsted is an avid fan of American Ninja Warrior and a passionate fan of sports fans. Larry, it's a thrill for me to welcome you tonight and for Gramercy Books to share your book with our community.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And in conversation with Larry is Rob Oller. Rob grew up on the shores of Lake Erie, rooting for the Cleveland Browns and Indians. He eventually paired his love for sports with his love-hate relationship with writing to enter journalism as a sports reporter. After graduating from Ohio State with a BA in journalism, Rob embarked on a 10-year stay at the News-Sun in Springfield, Ohio, before joining the Columbus Dispatch in 1995. Over the past 25 years, he's covered everything from putt-putt tournaments to the Masters, from high school football to the Super Bowl, and from pickup basketball games to the NBA Finals. Most often, you will find him sweating over columns about Ohio State football. Rob, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Pleasure to be here.
And thanks to all of you in our audience for joining us this evening. And now a warm welcome to Larry Olmsted in conversation with Rob Oller.
Hey, Larry, good to see you.
Likewise.
You bailed me out on a column a couple weeks ago, so I just wanted to thank you for that. I needed to write about what's COVID done to fans and, live sports versus TV. So we'll get into that. But kind of wanted to begin with this. Your credentials in terms of being a fan. Who do you like? Who are your teams? So that we know you're invested here. What'd you grow up and who do you follow?
Sure. And I do say in the book that, I don't consider myself an avid sports fan. Having said that, I find that a lot of people that I talk to say, oh, I'm not really a sports fan. I only follow, and then they reel off 4 or 5 or 8 teams. So I think we sell ourselves short sometimes. But I grew up with the New York Mets. I grew up in Queens, relatively close to Shea Stadium. First games I went to, fortunate enough to remember the Tom Seaver era when the Mets were good. And since then, I have morphed in that my sort of number one sport is NFL football. And being from New York, I stick with New York's only professional football team, the Bills.
Hey, 4 Super Bowls, right? Now, we won't talk about how those went, but okay, let's get into the book a little bit. I found it to be very interesting, especially for me, my perspective being on the other side of it and being a writer and interacting and having fans read you versus watch you is an interesting concept. So what was the genesis of the book? Can you just kind of explain? You say you're not a super, hardcore fan, but it was enough to want to write about it.
Yeah, my thing as a journalist has been looking for interesting ideas. And to me, the most interesting ideas are those that sort of hide in plain sight, which are things we know about, but don't know about. And this is the only connection between the 3 books I've done, is they all take something everybody knows about, the Guinness Book of Records or food or sports, and look at it from a different perspective. That being said, my perspective was originally different. I was motivated to do this book because I know 8 or 9 years ago, I went to a Red Sox Yankees game at Fenway Park in Boston. Beautiful stadium, not always the most appreciative fans. And I saw a couple with very young children dressed in t-shirts with obscenities directed at the Yankees. And I left the game wondering, what's wrong with these people? Is there something about sports that makes us crazy or bad? And that was sort of the progenitor of my idea. Maybe there's a story to be told here. But as soon as I dove into the data, I saw that was completely, that was sort of my gut reaction instinct, but it was totally wrong. And the complete opposite is true. Sports fandom brings us a lot of benefits, but I've come to realize that there were 40 some odd thousand other people at that game that day that I didn't notice and didn't think about afterwards because they were normal, well-adjusted, typical sports fans. And, when people always say, well, what about the crazy person? Most Americans are sports fans. Almost 200 million of us consider ourselves sports fans. You're going to have some bad apples. But what I saw that day was 2 bad apples and 40,000 plus good ones. And that's how it's kind of panned out in my research.
Of course, around here, they'd say there's about 111,000 bad ones up in Michigan Stadium. That's how they roll around here. What is a fan? I mean, that's sort of a duh maybe, but there's got to be sort of markers for, are there levels? Is it just one team, 2 teams? I mean, like you said, you're not diehard, and there's some other people that, superstitions, which you write about in the book, it's incredible some of the superstitions people have about their fans because they're just so into the team. Just describe a little bit about what's a fan.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question because I operate on 2 levels here. I talk to a lot of experts, psychologists, researchers who study fans, and then I talk to the fans themselves, and they have different answers to this question. So the researchers, unfortunately, they base your fandom mostly on allegiance to teams, which is a pretty easy way to do studies and keep them consistent. And there's something called the Spectator Sports Identification Scale that has been created by psychologists and is used widely around the world in all these studies to sort of give a baseline of how avid a fan you are. But it's based, again, on following a team and how much you follow that team, which sort of sells short a little bit the fans of golf or tennis or individual sports, boxing, but also just because of the logistics of doing these studies gets grossly more complicated with every team you add. Most of the studies, show support for my conclusions that, sports is good for us, but those are mostly based on people saying they're a fan of one team. The few studies that have been shown done on fans of multiple teams show these effects are even more powerful. And the average sports fan is a fan of 5 to 6 teams. So I think probably the benefits that I have are a little understated statistically. But then again, from my perspective, if I ask you if you're a sports fan and you say yes, that's good enough for me. You don't need any evidence, and that's my rule. Are you a sports fan? You told me you were. Yes.
That's great. Before we get into the health benefits, mental, physical, why do we care? Did you find anything in the people you talked to and the studies? What is it about sports that make it so passionate?
I did scratch the surface. That it's a sort of a different question. My question is, what does sports fandom do to us as individually in society? Why we care is sort of the billion-dollar question in sports. And unlike my topic, it has been exhaustively chased after with no real conclusions, but there are a few things that I have gleaned. And one is that the psychologists have found that being a sports fan, you merge the team with your own identity. It literally becomes part of you. And I think that would be possible for other kinds of entertainment fandom, but it's a level at which you care because it's now sort of part of your being is the team and following it or the sport. But to me, the big differentiator of sports is the unscripted, unpredictable live immediacy of it. And in a world where we've increasingly gone to streaming our entertainment and watching it on the device we want, when we want, and time has sort of been taken out of all other forms of TV, That's not the case for sports. I say in the book, nobody waits 17 weeks and then binges the NFL season the way they might with the Game of Thrones or something, because it kind of ruins it for you not to know. And I think part of the appeal is that uncertainty. And I am not against any other kind of fandom. And I personally, for example, I consider myself a Star Wars fan. But when I saw that first movie in 1977, I didn't have to wait 8 more sequels and 40 years to know the good guys were going to win. That's sort of a foregone conclusion, whether it's, Star Wars or James Bond or Mission Impossible, or you watch CSI, they're going to catch the guy. But with sports, you do not know what's going to happen. And if we knew with certainty that Team USA could not beat the Russians in Lake Placid, we wouldn't watch the game. And that's why we love underdog stories. That's why, if you Google, greatest sports movies of all time, Hoosiers is always #1 on the rankings, right? We love an upset, and it's part of the nature of sports is that you can have upsets, or Chris Berman says, right? That's why they play the game. And I think that's one of the reasons we love it, is because it's life is unpredictable and sports are unpredictable. So it's more real to us.
Yeah, I've always said that the sports are the true reality series. And it's pretty interesting because personally, I can't believe that Survivor is still a thing, right? But there are still passionate fans of Survivor because they don't know the outcome. That's part of it, even though it is, well, scripted.
Yep.
They still don't know. I mean, big time wrestling or professional wrestling, they don't know the outcome, even though it is scripted. There's something about that. I think you've tapped into something that the unknown really does draw us in. Okay, let's get into sort of the thrust of the book is health benefits. Yeah, it's never really crossed my mind. It's kind of in a way, an obvious thing is what does sports do to us and for us? But until your book, I hadn't really seen it anywhere, really. Let's start with the mental side of sports. And I'm curious, but I want to set this up because there's a lot of positives, but we're in a state where, yes, you have the Buckeyes, puts a bounce in your step, but you also have the Cleveland Browns and the Cincinnati Bengals, which are mentally. And maybe you can speak to this, it's not real positive all the time. It's kind of depressing. So mentally, it's a health thing. Explain those two, more positive than negative, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on the teams that don't do really well and whether that's still a benefit.
Yeah, so contrary to what we might assume, it seems obvious that happiness in sports is not as directly related to winning and losing as you might think. So most of the sports psychologists have identified about 24 different aspects of mental health in which sports fans do better than the rest of the public when surveyed. Things like having lower rates of depression, higher self-esteem, more satisfaction with their social life, and being more extroverted. And most of these come from one thing, which is a sense of belonging to a community. And humans are by nature tribal creatures. It's in our DNA since the Stone Age. We want to form packs and tribes and villages and towns and city states and countries and groups that we live in. And at the same time, in modern times, a lot of the social organizations that serve that purpose have been in decline. As a matter of fact, all of them except sports, everything from bowling leagues to the Elks Club, even organized religion, all in declining numbers. Sports fandom provides this sense of belonging very accessibly, very democratically to anyone of any age, race, income, education who wants to be a Cleveland Browns fan. And it's also a community that extends beyond just watching the game. When you see you're in the supermarket and you're wearing your Browns hat and you see somebody in a Browns shirt, you look at, an NHL executive described this to me. He said that in the industry, they call this the head nod, right? You see this fan, you make eye contact, you nod, you're connected now, even though you're total strangers. And again, it doesn't matter what your backgrounds are. And then you get in your car and you get on the road and you see a Browns bumper sticker. And it never occurred to me before I wrote this book, but you never see a car with like a Harry Potter bumper sticker, right? Sports bumper stickers are everywhere. Other kinds of fandom, not so much. So you're inundated with this reminder that you belong to this community, whether you're watching the game or not in your daily life, especially if you're in a hometown. It's a little different if maybe you're a displaced Cleveland Browns fan living in Alaska or something. You're not going to see as many hats and t-shirts. But so that's one thing, is a sense of community brings us a lot of these mental health benefits. Then when it comes to the winning and the losing, I mean, in every major sport, there's only one winner. So if you looked at it as like, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers just won the Super Bowl, every other team lost, that would suggest that there'd be a whole lot of unhappy sports fans. And that would be applied to every sport. But the reality is it's not that simple. And as one of the psychologists described to me, it's like we have a sports fandom circuit breaker in our head, so that your upside, joy, potential improvement from wins, especially big wins, is basically limitless. But your downside, you can only get so depressed over a game or a loss or a bad season. And so if your team is 50-50, and most teams in most sports over the long haul are pretty average, you still come out ahead because you get more out of those wins than you lose in the losses, even though it would seem it would be a coin flip. And one of the most famous studies of sports fans is that shows that they can disassociate themselves from failure very easily. Sports fans routinely say, "We won," when the team wins. But when they lose, they always say, "They lost." Not "we lost," they lost. So that they put the onus on the losing on the team and the players, but they take credit partially for the wins. So it makes the wins that much sweeter, and especially big games. They say time heals all wounds, and it's true with most losses, but the wins never go away. So if you're the Chicago Cubs fan, the long-suffering Chicago Cubs fan, you finally won the World Series. You want it to happen again, but if it doesn't, if it's the only World Series you win in your lifetime, you're never going to forget it. But you're going to forget a lot of other things that happened along the way. And for example, I said I'm a Mets fan. I remember 1986, the last time they won the World Series. I remember the players. I remember Bill Buckner. But I don't remember what happened in 1989 or 1983 or 1992, except the Mets lost again. But the details, they're just sort of the fog of history. And so surprisingly, we can endure a lot of bad seasons. And when they're really bad, like the Cubs, or if you remember when the New Orleans Saints fans used to wear paper bags over their heads to go to the game, right? But they still went to the game. That's the thing, is fans of really losing teams sometimes take extra special pride in their suffering because they're real fans. There's nobody is jumping on the bandwagon for a team that hasn't won anything in years. And that, I interviewed some older Cubs fans who viewed the World Series win with mixed emotions. They had always wanted it, but it took a little bit of the specialness away from the nature of their fandom, because now everybody wanted to be a Cubs fan. So, winning, they say winning isn't everything, it's the only thing, but that's not really true for fans.
Well, speaking again, this is interesting, because growing up a Cleveland Indians fan who was on the losing side of that World Series, the Cubs sort of lost their mystique. The lovable little Cubbies, in terms of their fans, suddenly became the corporate Cubbies. This is speaking from a Cleveland point of view. It's funny you say that, of being all in. It's almost like a protectionism, a mental protectionism when your team loses. Speaking from experience, just covering sports and seeing fans' comments, officiating, right? The officials were terrible. That call went against us. There's all these rationalizations. Sometimes they're legit, of course, but sometimes they're not. But world's out to get us. That's, of course, especially a Cleveland thing. But I would just say two things to add to what you said, which is we and us. Sports fans are we and us. It's almost like they've suited up and they're on the field. Well, I mean, where else do you hear that, where it's not just a team, it's my team, and it's we and us. It's like family. So that's the mental side of it. Are there physical benefits? Of course there are.
Yeah, there are. Now, these are not as pronounced as the mental benefits, or I should say they're harder to decipher because sports fans are more active than non-fans when surveyed, studied. But the question here is, is it the chicken or the egg? Some sports fans are sports fans because they already love doing sports, or maybe they played Little League baseball or they played high school football. So they are sports fans, but maybe they were active already. They would be active anyway. It's not necessarily the act of being a sports fan that makes them more active. So I tried to find whether there was any evidence that simply being a spectator could have health advantages. And it turns out that, yes, it's not for every fan, but there's most notably something called the participation effect, which is when otherwise sedentary people are transformed into participants because of watching sports. And the examples, probably the best known example in American history would be what the cycling industry calls the Lance effect, which was Lance Armstrong sort of popularizing not just the Tour de France and coverage of cycling, which was popular in Europe, but not here, but the idea of cycling. Throughout his, what turned out to be checkered career, bike sales exploded. Participation in cycling in the United States exploded. This in turn led to the really big national increase in these charity events where you go ride 25, 50, 75, or 100 miles in a day and raise money for cancer research or whatever your cause is. There are hundreds of these kind of events all over the country, most of which did not exist pre-Lance Armstrong. That in turn also sort of spawned a charitable industry in 5 and 10K fun runs. There were always marathons, but just the idea that you could go out and do something athletic to raise money for a cause, and that's really good for society. Now, that's one example. The ongoing one that I have some data on in the book is the Olympics. After every Olympic Games, there's a surge in gym memberships. It's sort of like a New Year's resolution, except it comes around every 2 years now. When I was growing up, it was every 4 years, right? But again, here it's a little bit different because when people watch the Olympics, they attract people who maybe don't watch a lot of other sports on TV for the spectacle, but also even people who do watch sports are watching sports that they don't typically watch, whether it's gymnastics or rowing or cross-country skiing or track and field. And there are a lot of sports that showcase individual fitness and athleticism. And at the same time, they're somewhat accessible where I could watch, the dream team play and know I'm never going to be able to dunk a basketball like Michael Jordan, but I can go to the gym and use the rowing machine or run on the treadmill or ride the stationary bike. And that's exactly what happens after the Olympics is there's an uptick in what they call general fitness. It's not really sports, it's interest in making ourselves healthier. So, that's a good thing. And that's why I was glad to see that Tokyo looks like it's going to be a go, because spectators in person or not, it doesn't matter. It's good for us to have it on TV.
Great stuff. And just a reminder to those watching that the Q&A, if you need to ask or want to ask a question, we're going to leave time at the end for Larry to answer your questions. If you have any for me, that's fine too. Would prefer you use the Q&A than the chat, but we see the chat too. So let's move on here to, I just want to touch briefly as sort of a shout out to you, Larry, that this is not just a knee-jerk, off the top of your head book, that you've done a lot of research, and it's kind of akin to where we are in sports today, which is analytics. Analytics is big. You can't just write stories. You need to back it up with sort of numbers, and you've done that in this book. You've kind of taken an analytics view of it. How important was it to you to do that?
Well, it's important. I don't want it to be dry. The book is not a math text by any means. I wanted it to be appealing to both fans and not fans, but I also want it to be defensible because it's very easy. I mean, I looked at the stereotypes of sports fans by non-fans and by Hollywood and sitcoms, and there's a perception that it's a waste of time. Sports fans are these, fat couch potatoes, football widows, this whole thing. And all of which turned out to basically be untrue, but it's not enough for me to say it's not true. I have to be able to prove it's not true. So, I don't want to, at some point my editor says to me, the 10th study is enough. You don't have to have 50 saying the same thing, but there are 50.
That's great. So most of our viewers, I guess it's viewers, read books. So they might have some pushback about this, but you can defend it. Every hobby is beneficial. Every hobby is good for mental health. You do what you love, but you make an interesting point and make the case that sports sort of trumps even other leisure activities, whether it's going to concerts, whether it's gardening, whatever it may be. Why are sports so special? And why are they better than other sort of leisure activities?
And I should preface this by saying I too like to read.
So I hope everyone does. Reading is good.
But it's so, as I said before, that the happiness associated with sports is not just a matter of watching football makes me happy, the way reading a book makes me happy, or watching Star Wars makes me happy. It's this more intrinsic happiness we get from the sense of belonging to a community. And that's where it's really differentiated. And you can get that through other forms of entertainment, but you have to sort of be at the really extreme end of it. If you're a Harry Potter fan and you dress up and you go to conventions and you chat online about it and you're very involved in the Harry Potter fan community, then you can feel like you belong. But most casual fans don't do that, but they do in sports. And also there's not 30 Harry Potter conventions on TV every day. It's much easier for sports fans, but it's also the way that we actually consume the entertainment. So think about reading, right? You can read a book, but it's a solitary act. You can belong to a book club. You can then go and discuss it. But with same as a movie, you can watch Star Wars and then we can talk about it, but you can't watch it and talk about it communally the way we do with sports on the couch in our living room, because you would be kicked out of the theater, you would be kicked out of the library. And again, that the fact that you kind of have to consume it in real time changes that. So when I watch, again, I'm home alone and I watch a Bills game, my team, and I see the stadium in Orchard Park filled with people. I mean, you talked about this sense of us, we. That comes from the fact that you're not really, people think of watching a football game or a baseball game, but what you're really watching is a stadium that is filled with both players and spectators. And the spectators far outnumber the players, and they're all wearing the jerseys of your team, and they are on the screen all the time, a constant reminder that you're part of this crowd. And that's why when they interview sports fans, they feel like they're at the game, even when they're home alone. And when I'm home alone watching Star Wars, I don't feel like I'm with anyone else in the same way, even though I like Star Wars. So that's to me, it's not that other forms of fandom are bad, but you don't get the same, most people don't get the same immersive community. Again, you can, but you really have to work at it.
Right. And this we'll take it from beyond the individual to the corporate and the communal here. And you took me back with this book because you wrote about 9/11, how sports united us and gave us hope. And you mentioned the Vegas, shooting and the Boston Marathon bombing, and you can speak to that. And now we've got a new thing called COVID, which how has sports impacted that positively?
Yeah, so this personally is my favorite part of the book. And one of the reasons is, like I said, I grew up in Queens. First games I ever went to were Mets games, Shea Stadium. I also used to work in the World Trade Center. So the post 9/11 reaction of sports is very vivid to me. All professional, really the last time before the COVID pandemic that all professional sports in this country were shut down for a prolonged period of time, not as long, it was about 10 days. And then came back with this Mets Braves game in Shea Stadium, which Mike Piazza hit this, sort of Cinderella story, come from behind home run that's become iconic part of baseball. But it was the first time after any kind of mass trauma, the sort of reaction is a lockdown. People are a little afraid to go out, but they also want to regroup and gather. And we don't have any venues in this country for doing that are bigger than sports stadiums. You mentioned the Big House, not your favorite maybe, but it's the largest stadium in the country. But any sports stadium is bigger than the biggest mosque or synagogue or church. So when people were able to go back to Shea Stadium and fill it up, one sports fan told me that was the moment when it was okay to laugh and clap again. And that's a big change following 9/11. But so I remember this, but I always thought it was sort of an anomaly because 9/11 is sort of an anomaly. But when I did the research, I found that no, it's not. Sports has been playing this post-traumatic community healing function since the days of ancient Greece. But, after Pearl Harbor, after the Boston Marathon bombing, after natural disasters, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Harvey, typhoons in Asia, earthquakes, and then most recently, pre-COVID, the Golden Knights in Las Vegas. And there, you had kind of a perfect storm because Las Vegas is the biggest city in the United States that doesn't have a professional team in any of the major sports. A couple of million people, no teams, very, very unusual. Then they finally get one. Hey, NHL team, the Golden Knights. 9 days before their first game, they have the worst mass shooting in American history. And the city is, again, traumatized. People are literally afraid to leave their homes. And the difference this time is this is 2017. I was able to go out there and interview people who had been shot, people who had been shot at, the mayor, cab drivers, Knights executives, people from a very big cross section of Las Vegas. And when a woman explained to me how she was afraid to leave her home and, was talking to her therapist on the phone and then got invited to a Knights game and was afraid to leave and didn't go. And then got invited to a Knights game and didn't go, and then saw it on TV and said, I got to get out of my house someday. I'm going to go. And finally went, and never been to a hockey game before. She was a basketball fan, fell in love with it, went to 50 more games that season, and basically explained to me how, the Knights saved her and saved the city. At that point, it becomes impossible to dismiss sports as trivial or entertainment or frivolous. They're a vital part of the fabric of our society. And that really touched me. And now we're seeing it again with COVID, both the ways that sport has supported us and distracted us and made it okay to clap and smile at times throughout this, but also ultimately the thing after 9/11 was signaling a return to normalcy. After the Vegas Golden Knights, it's okay to go into a crowd on the Strip again. And same thing with COVID, when we can go into a stadium and sit shoulder to shoulder with 50,000 people and high five a stranger without worrying about it killing us, that's going to be the true light at the end of the tunnel has arrived.
Yeah, segueing there. So that's kind of community. Then we get into societal stuff, sports and race, Jackie Robinson, Jesse Owens, sports and gender, Title IX. It touches all these tentacles, reach out, and sports kind of mostly positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing is, if you're a sports fan and you read this book, you're going to like it and you're going to find things you can relate to. I remember watching with my grandfather. There's a lot of that kind of nostalgia. But what I really want is for non-sports fans to read it and come to the realization that sports fandom makes the world they live in a better place, even if they never watch a game. And they can go thank a sports fan for that or not or whatever, but that it's not frivolous. It has real impact. And, everybody sort of knows the Jackie Robinson story, but that's part of a long continuum of making the public more tolerant, more open-minded, for advancing the sort of democratic ideals we like in this country, And then sports also has played a role in the international peace process and nation building and reconciliation that at a level that will surprise a lot of people. So I think, that the bigger, the meta societal effects of sports fandom are will be the most surprising to even sports fans.
Okay, so we can't just stick our head in the sand here. I see it, you see it, all fans see this. There is an ugly or a negative side to sports in terms of, and you talked about it. The genesis of the book was, obscenities on a t-shirt. With social media now, Twitter, just everyone having, knives out. Is this a problem? Is this a growing problem? It's always been there, but what do you see through your research and through writing the book has changed, if anything, about sort of this dark side?
I actually think, well, in some ways it's getting better. I think fans, one of the things that bothered me was when fans tolerate criminal behavior from players because they help their team win. I think fans are becoming less tolerant of that, which is a good thing. The other issue, the sort of Twitter and the politicization of sports, that I think we're in more of a transient period, because a couple of things have happened. I mean, there have always been activist athletes, but they did not have the platform that they had now. And especially if you look at John Carlos and Tommy Smith at the Mexico City Games, or Muhammad Ali, they did what they did and then had to rely on their message and images of it being filtered through the press and being not distorted or reaching. But now, somebody like LeBron James can reach out and send his message in exactly his words directly to many, many millions of people. So that platform has given athletes an expanded voice, which in turn, has encouraged them to use that voice more, which in turn has sort of forced the hand of the teams and leagues, which always tried to sort of stay out of it. So we are definitely going through a sort of watershed moment of more participation in issues and causes and politics. And that does bother some sports fans, but it's not a new thing. It's just amplified. And I think we'll get used to it.
We'll finish up with this before we get to questions. And I've noticed this through COVID, with the piped in noise, with the empty arenas, with, golf courses with no fans. And I find, just a little side note here, I just found it amazing and hilarious where these guys are so conditioned to have crowds that they would make a putt and they would wave to a crowd that wasn't there. So that they do need fans. But I guess I would say sports can exist without fans, as we've learned. But there are no fans without sports. Where it gets interesting, and I'd love to hear you about this, so much is lost if fans aren't allowed to be at events. I think of the Ohio State at Iowa, and you write about this in the book, and Ohio State Buckeyes fans will know this, the Iowa wave. That is something, and there's just, it touches your heart because fans are there. What is it about being on site?
Well, first, I just want to say with the Iowa wave, we talk about there's divisiveness, and I find that sports is a place where we more often than not can come together. And, I talk about the universal language, breaks down barriers, but there's a perfect example. What makes the Iowa wave so special is that it's everyone. It's not it's the visitors, right? It's, for a minute, we forget everything about who we're rooting for and we root for the kids. But in terms of the being there, so I think short term, through the pandemic, and it wasn't even the whole pandemic, because sports, people are returning, it was fine. It would, to have empty stadiums, better than no stadiums, let's say. But long term, yeah, that's not really viable. It diminishes the quality of that sense of community. I mean, like I said, you watch the game, you see the fans. If you don't see the fans, you're no longer belonging there. And it certainly diminishes, the experience of the athletes. I read when the Dallas Mavericks just a couple of weeks ago had their first game with fans. And they only had 1,200 people in an arena that holds 28,000, something like that. So pretty skimpy. All were like vaccinated first responders, but the players talked about how big a difference it made, even that little, smidgen of people. Otherwise, it's like a practice, right? But so I think, we needed sports to get us through the pandemic more than we needed fans in the bleachers. And I personally am a very conservatively cautious COVID person. I'm not going back to a stadium right now, but I will once, I'm vaccinated and things improve. But I think long-term, sports needs, even though the vast majority of fans watch games on TV, it's having people at the stadium that makes it electric. And a matter of fact, certain sports, like I'm not a big car racing guy, but I've been to a NASCAR race. I've been to the Indy 500, and I wouldn't watch those sports on TV, but you have to be there to appreciate it, sort of.
That's great. Okay, well, thanks. Very informative. We're going to turn to questions now, and we've got some good ones. So this is from Ray Booth. I hope I can say the names here because I just did. Better to ask forgiveness than the permission, right? All right, so I'm old. Join the club, Ray. I'm old, but I remember knowing everything more or less about every player on the Pittsburgh Pirates, including Roberto Clemente, Willie Stargell, and the team was pretty much the same from year to year. Now I have trouble keeping up with what players are on what team. How did the business culture change the home team identity?
That's a really good question. The comedian Jerry Seinfeld does this famous routine about we're just rooting for laundry, right? Because the uniforms of players are interchangeable. But to a degree, that's true. And that's what separates team sports, from individual sports. You might be a big Tiger Woods fan, but sooner or later, Tiger Woods is going to stop playing. He may have already, but, even if he doesn't, he will. Whereas presumably the Pirates will still be playing 100 years from now. That's why the team, it is the team, and people choose, they've found that people say they choose their team, but they don't choose it. They choose it the same way they choose religion, which is based on two factors: where you're born and what your parents believe. So you're born in Pittsburgh, you're probably going to be a Pirates fan, and you're going to be a Pirates fan regardless of who is on that team. I do think it was nicer when you had players. And actually the very first baseball bat I ever owned when I was a little kid was a Willie Stargell autograph model. But I even think of like Derek Jeter, or had Tom Brady not left the Patriots, these kind of career franchise players, but it is becoming few and far between. I think that's a little bit sad.
All right, this is R.P. Burke. Positive versus negative fandom. We kind of covered that toward the end. And Michigan haters, there's nobody watching this who's in that category, of course. Michigan haters astonished me when I arrived here in 1995. Well, I could stop there. The 1990s were not kind to the Buckeyes when it comes to Michigan, but arrived here in 1995. My hometown was full of Yankees haters. Today's equivalent would be Patriot haters, but I'd never seen anything like Michigan Week. It brought to mind the 10 minutes hate in 1984. Does negative fandom affect the individual psyche or carry over into negative attitudes in other areas? Does the company of haters help or hurt the community? That's kind of deep.
Yeah. So I think, especially regional rivalry is one of the things that makes us passionate about sports. And it does bother me living in New England to see people say, I hate the Yankees, I hate their fans. And I think, like, you don't even know these people. But I also don't really believe they hate the people. They hate the idea of the Yankees fan, not the actual fan. That being said, that kind of tribalism was one of the biggest stumbling blocks that I dealt with doing the book. And the good news, at least in professional sports, is that fantasy sports is having an impact on that, a real impact. It's already, they study this, it's already measurable by having to draft what psychologists call the hated others onto your team. You then, soften your view towards it. And like I interviewed a really diehard Redskins fan who was also a very avid fantasy football player, several leagues, year after year, since fantasy football started, basically. And he told me it took him 4 or 5 years before he could draft anyone from the Cowboys. But, he got sick of losing, and you have to sooner or later. And then suddenly you want them to do well. And that's why we have the Red Zone channel. And so I think that the tribalism isn't actually a dangerous, bad thing for society. But at the same time, I think it's good that it's softening a little bit.
Yeah, I hear you. Sabrina King, did you do any research on how or why people become fans of specific teams? Supporting hometown teams seems logical, but I'm an Ohio girl who loves the Bears.
Well, yeah, like I said, the two biggest factors are where you're born and your parents. And that also applies to what sports you watch, because most big cities have multiple sports. But if your parents are big baseball fans, you're not likely to suddenly become a hockey fan as a little kid. You might later in life develop that. But there are exceptions, and they can be based on the weirdest little things when you're young. But most people choose their teams when they're young. And the oddest example is the Atlanta Braves. With the advent of TBS, they were the first nationally televised team, no blackouts. And so there are Braves fans to this day found in all sorts of niches that might be between markets, or it was the only thing they could get on TV. And now, of course, it would be a little different, I think, growing up today, where you have 24/7 access to everything. But certainly if you wanted your dad to take you out to the ballpark, you only had one or two choices in most cities.
Yeah, it's interesting here in Columbus, there are more Pittsburgh Steelers fans than I would have thought. So I do think there is a success failure element a little bit. I mean, Dallas Cowboys, America's team, because they were good. They wouldn't have been America's team if they stunk. The Steelers have been really good when the Browns and the Bengals kind of weren't. I think it goes a little deeper. There's sort of a persona of the Steelers being tough, doing it the right way. So it's intriguing. I mean, you'd have to really dig down to get into some of the minutia on this. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of sometimes, well, you just like the uniform color. I grew up on the north coast of Ohio, but I love the Raiders uniforms. So, I like the Raiders. I also like the Chargers uniforms. There's a lot of elements to this fan thing. All right. Here's one that Larry and I can answer together. And I'll be curious if there's a difference in the answers here. All right. I'm only 50 pages into the book, but what's your take about, quote, homers in sports journalism? Maybe this is a little more me, homers. And I can speak to that first or second. If you want to address it, feel free.
You go first.
Okay, so I grew up in the era of the worst thing you could be is a homer in sports journalism. What is a homer? Well, you're a cheerleader for your team. You're not objective. I fully admit I came up through the Watergate era where it was find the truth. If an old boss of mine says, if your mother says she loves you, look into it. So that's where I stand. So yeah, sports journalism, homers. I think it's probably an inside journalism issue more. It bothers me more than it probably bothers readers. Maybe it doesn't bother you at all, Larry. I know there's a guy named Bill Simmons. I teach a class in sports writing. There's a guy named Bill Simmons who kind of changed the whole game. He was an ESPN, and he started to write as a fan, just like on a bar stool, talking to a buddy. And he made no bones about that. He was a Celtics fan, Boston fan, and he wrote that way. And he was a really good writer, And I think that started to change the game to now where it's almost normal to cheer for your team as a writer. I see it among younger writers. And I can't say personally I don't like it, but it's where the culture is going. Do you have any thoughts on it?
I do. I find that interesting because I think normally if your beat is covering, the Knicks, I think, of course you're going to sort of lean towards being interested in their success. And be more critical of things that take away that from the team's quality. But my experience, and I don't know a lot of sports writers compared to I know fans, but I've done, I know a lot of sports radio broadcasters, and my experience is journalism is a highly mobile field. You worked in Ohio for 10 years. So a lot of the people I've been interviewed by, no matter where they're on the air, they're not from there. They might be broadcasting in Tampa, but they're from Oakland. So they don't. I think they have their home team loyalties, but because they're not in their home places, it hasn't struck me as a big problem.
Okay, yeah, I think TV may be a little different too. I think when you're going to a national audience, Kirk Herbstreit here, right? He's the classic example of Herbie, played at Ohio State, came up on local radio here, go Buckeyes, the whole thing, OHIO, and then he went national and really couldn't afford to do that from, well, I guess he could. It depends where you stay on, where you stand on that. And he took a lot of heat from Columbus listeners and watchers for really, I think they wanted him to be a cheerleader, or they thought he almost bent over too far backwards to be critical of Ohio State. So I think, that's where we are. He had to leave. He moved from Columbus, not totally to get away from Buckeye Nation. I think to get more centrally, he's in Nashville area now. But that really doesn't tie into the book too much, other than sports writers deep down are fans. We've just had a lot of it knocked out of us because we've seen so much. We've seen behind the closed doors, sort of the dirty laundry, so to speak. And people always say, "What team do I root for?" I root for my team, which is me. Deadline and getting the story in. So I'm a fan of me in some respects and the story, if that answers the question. It's 8 o'clock. I think we need to wrap up here. Larry, thank you. Very informative. I recommend the book. It's things you've never thought about. You know what? You mentioned Seinfeld, and it crossed my mind. You're a little bit of, the Seinfeld of writing this book. And now, not that it's a book about nothing like his show, but you look at things differently than maybe the norm. And I appreciate that. As somebody who sort of looks at things a little oddly myself and kind of tries to look at it just tilted, excellent job on the book. So I recommend it.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for having us.
And thanks to both of you. What a fascinating conversation. Great questions, Rob. And thank you for sharing fascinating sports research with us, Larry. I encourage all of you in the audience to tell all of the sports fans about Larry's book. Clearly, and here it is, clearly this is a gift for them. Again, thank you, Larry and Rob, for a great conversation.